This is a video response to Martymer 81's video, William Lane Craig is wrong about cosmology. While I am personally not convinced by the Kalam cosmological argument, I think it is a bad idea to allow poor arguments to go unchallenged, regardless of their conclusions. Also, some of these points can also be related to the more Thomistic arguments I find more convincing. Let us begin.
Question begging. The universe is the set of everything except God, so God is the one thing that doesn't begin to exist. The argument is logically equivalent to the following. Premise 1. Everything except God has a cause. Premise 2. Everything except God is everything except God. Conclusion. Therefore, everything except God has a cause. Special pleading. In order to avoid an infinite regression of causes, the argument assumes without justification that God didn't begin to exist as well.
This is probably just a confusion regarding the definition of God as used by philosophers. The entire point of these cosmological arguments is to show that something, which exists necessarily, caused the universe to exist. William Lane Craig does not just assert this, but he provides arguments against an infinite regress, for example. Whether I agree with this argument or not is a different story, but it is not special pleading. Now, the typical definition of God is not this flying magic man in the sky, which atheists like to bash. Typically, God is defined as a necessary being meaning to exist. So saying something must exist necessarily to, for example, prevent the infinite regress, and to say God exists is really saying the same thing. We are not just using a different word here.
Equivocation. The universe supposedly began to exist ex nihilo, out of literally nothing, but all things we know of that are caused to begin to exist are rearrangements of pre-existing stuff. The two premises use different meanings of the phrase begin to exist.
You are just assuming here that Craig is talking about ex materia causation, because as far as I'm aware, he has not explicitly stated this. Actually, I just did a quick Google search, and this is what William Lane Craig says himself to this objection. I am using the word cause here simply to mean something that produces something else, and in terms of which that other thing, called the effect, can be explained. Whether it's an efficient cause or a material cause is simply left out of account. So I'm not specifying in the first premise what kind of cause it has to be, but simply that there must be a cause. Another way I would put this is to say that cause in this example simply means a sufficient reason. If you end up denying that things require a sufficient reason to begin to exist, then you start having these issues regarding why things are not just popping into existence all the time. Why do we even have to give a sufficient reason for why we believe in God if the sufficient reason is not necessary? Denying that we need to use reason is pretty much just the nuclear option in avoiding the existence of God.
Fallacy of composition. The universe is not a thing, but a set of things. Even if every thing that begins to exist must have a cause, this doesn't have to apply to the set of all such things.
I think your claim that the universe is not a thing is just grasping at straws. This same argument can be applied to people, as we are just collections of things as well. So obviously we are not things and we can just pop into existence for no reason. You're making a further mistake, and it's based upon your false understanding of cause as defined by Craig. But once you understand that by cause we mean simply a sufficient reason, you should realize there can be no difference between things in this regard. If you say the universe can just pop into existence for no reason, then there's no special reason why only the universe can pop into existence, so there's no reason to believe everything else cannot pop into existence. Thus we have obvious issues.
While these objections all work and completely destroy the argument, one thing they don't do is show just how badly you have to butcher physics in order to make the argument. For starters, what does it mean to begin to exist? I don't know, because in physics we don't use that kind of terminology.
And here's your problem. Yes, William Lane Craig uses physics to support the premise that the universe began to exist. However, his argument is a philosophical argument, so you have to understand philosophy to refute it. That should be quite obvious. So Martymer 81 goes on from this to argue about physics, all to come to the following conclusion.
In other words, the Borguth-Vilenkin theorem doesn't apply. While I certainly have my doubts about this model, the point is that no, we cannot categorically declare that time has a beginning. And if it doesn't, then Kalam falls flat on its ass, because the second premise is not just unfounded, it's downright false. The other possibility is, of course, that time does have a beginning. And for the record, based on my current knowledge of cosmology, this is what I believe.
Okay, so Martymer 81 must be confused because, of course, William Lane Craig is only arguing that evidence supports the conclusion which Martymer 81 seems to agree with. William Lane Craig does not have to prove with 100% certainty that the universe began to exist. I'm sure he realizes that science does not provide that kind of certainty. So really, this objection is based upon a misunderstanding of what Craig is saying and does not harm the Kalam cosmological argument in any way.
In other words, if time began to exist, it must have begun to exist without being associated with any kind of transition. And that exposes another equivocation fallacy in the argument, in addition to the whole ex nihilo ex materia thing that I've already covered. Premise 1. All things with beginnings with transitions are caused. Premise 2. The universe has a beginning without a transition. Conclusion. The universe is caused. Either that or premise 1 refers to beginnings without transitions, but that would render the argument circular, because as far as we know, nothing but the universe could begin without a transition. I mean, if time doesn't exist, the idea of something other than time beginning to exist is nonsensical. If time does exist, then the beginning necessarily coincides with a system transitioning from one state to another, so we're left with premise 1. All things with beginnings without transitions, in other words, the universe, are caused. Premise 2. The universe has a beginning without a transition, which we already established. Conclusion. The universe is caused, which we already said.
First of all, I've already pointed out that William Lane Craig is not arguing for any particular type of cause, just a cause in general. He is just arguing everything needs a sufficient reason to begin to exist. So your argument fails there. Secondly, the idea of something beginning to exist as caused by something independent of time has to do with something philosophers call ontological priority. God exists prior to time in that God's existence is necessary for the existence of the universe. But the universe's existence is not necessary for God's existence. God is also prior to time in that he exists without time. So these ideas do not mean that God actually exists at a time before time, nor does it mean that that there was a time when there was nothing. Actually, this applies to anything that is caused of things simultaneously. Craig likes to use the example of a chandelier being held up by a chain. The sufficient reason for the chandelier being held up is the chain holding it up. There's no need for a transition in time for this type of causality. This means your claim that this only applies to the universe is mistaken. no matter what we consider. In conclusion, a lot of what you have said could have easily been avoided by a simple Google search of what William Lane Craig has said in response to this. Again, I am not a big fan of William Lane Craig, but I'm not a fan of people failing to do their research on a topic before making a rebuttal either. Thanks for watching.